The sky torn open, April 4th, 1965, over Thanh Hoa Province, North Vietnam. Captain Carlyle Smitty Harris of the U.S. Air Force banked his F-105 Thunder Chief, the powerful jet responding smoothly after a successful strike on the Ham Rong Bridge. A moment of professional satisfaction was instantly vaporized as the sky erupted around him. Geysers of 37mm anti-aircraft fire stitched the air, a deadly blossoming garden of black puffs. On his six, a silver dart materialized, a MiG-17, fast and lethal at low altitude. Before he could react, a percussive shudder ripped through his aircraft. Cannon rounds, like a giant's metal fists, tore through his fuselage. Alarms blared in a panicked chorus. The controls went dead in his hands, transforming his billion-dollar fighter jet into a plummeting piece of junk. Experience and training took over. Harris pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blasted away into the slipstream with a deafening roar. An instant later, the rocket seat fired, kicking him out of the cockpit and into the sky. The wind slammed him like a physical blow, a solid wall of air that stole his breath. His parachute deployed with a bone-jarring snap that felt like it might tear his spine apart. Suspended beneath the silken dome, a surreal quiet descended. He watched his Thunder Chief, his trusted steed, cartwheel into the dense jungle below, trailing a thick plume of black smoke that marked the grave of his mission, and perhaps his life as he knew it. The ground rushed up with terrifying speed. He hit a rice paddy hard, the impact driving his knees deep into the thick, warm mud and water. Pain flared through his legs and back. Before he could even think to release his parachute harness, they were on him. Armed villagers, materializing from the landscape, surrounded him in a tight, menacing circle. Rifles, old and new, pointed at his chest. Rough hands grabbed him, tearing at his flight suit. Fists struck his face, snapping his head back. A rifle butt cracked against his ribs, and the agony was so sharp he gasped. They bound his arms tightly behind his back with rough hemp rope that immediately began to cut into his wrists, drawing blood. The crowd grew larger, a chorus of angry voices shouting in a language he couldn't understand, though their hatred was a universal tongue. Women spat on him, their faces contorted with fury. Children, mimicking their elders, threw stones that bounced off his helmet. An NVA soldier, more disciplined but no less hostile, shoved him toward a waiting military truck. For Captain Harris, a 27-year-old pilot from Russellville, Kentucky, the throbbing physical pain was a distant noise compared to the cold, horrifying realization settling like a block of ice in his gut. His war had not ended. It had just transformed into something far more personal and infinitely worse. The truck bounced north on cratered roads for 3 days. Harris sat blindfolded, plunged into a world of jolting motion and stifling heat. He was squeezed between two guards who would jab him viciously with their rifle barrels whenever he shifted position or slumped from exhaustion. With every bump, the rope cut deeper into his wrists. His hands swelled and went numb, a dead weight behind his back. They fed him only twice during the journey, small, foul-tasting balls of cold rice that were crawling with weevils. Water came in infrequent sips from a rusty tin cup, the guards often throwing it in his face as much as in his mouth, a petty act of cruelty he was powerless to protest. At night, they did not stop at a camp, but simply chained him to a tree near the road, while the guards slept in shifts nearby. Mosquitoes, drawn by his sweat and blood, feasted on his exposed skin, their high-pitched whine a constant torment. Through the bottom edge of his grimy blindfold, he caught glimpses of a larger collection point. Other prisoners were being loaded onto trucks just like his. Americans, maybe a dozen of them. All were battered, their faces swollen, their uniforms torn. All were utterly silent, their eyes hollow with shock and fear. No one spoke. The guards made that rule brutally clear with the casual threat of their rifle butts. On the third day, the sounds changed. The rumbling of the truck was joined by the din of a city. the constant jingling of bicycle bells, the shouts of street vendors, the unfamiliar hum of dense traffic. The truck lurched to a halt. Rough hands dragged him from the truck bed and onto the scorching pavement. His blindfold was ripped away, and the sudden harsh sunlight made him flinch. Before him stood a massive, forbidding gate set in a high concrete wall, its top crenellated with a jagged crown of broken glass and rusted barbed wire. The architecture was distinctly French colonial, but weather-beaten and grim, the thick walls stained the color of dried blood. Above the gate, faded yellow letters spelled out a name, Maison Centrale, the Central House. He would later learn the French had built this place in 1896, a fortress designed to hold and break Vietnamese revolutionaries. Now it would serve a new master and a different purpose. The Americans captured here would soon give it their own name, a piece of dark, ironic humor in the face of hell. They would call it the Hanoi Hilton. Guards shoved Harris through the gate and into a large courtyard where the oppressive April heat radiated off the concrete like an open oven, instantly amplifying his misery. The complex sprawled before him, long, menacing cell blocks extending in wings, guard towers looming at each corner, and a confusing maze of smaller, nondescript buildings. The French had originally designed Hoa Lo prison to hold around 200 prisoners, mostly in solitary cells designed for maximum isolation. The North Vietnamese, however, had packed it with hundreds more, mostly American airmen shot down over the north in this rapidly escalating air war. Harris could see the main cell blocks that would become infamous among the POWs. New Guy Village for the fresh arrivals like himself, Little Vegas with its rooms grimly named after casinos, and Heartbreak Hotel, the dreaded section where the worst interrogations took place. But he would only learn these names later, whispered between prisoners in desperate, fragmented messages. For now, he was just a piece of human wreckage being processed. Guards stripped him naked in the middle of the courtyard, a public humiliation. They photographed him, documenting his healthy state for their records. They weighed him 173 pounds. They would track his descent from this number. A guard barked a series of commands in Vietnamese. Harris, understanding nothing, stood motionless. A swift, hard fist to his kidney taught him to bow. Another sharp blow taught him to bow deeper, an act of submission he had never performed in his life. They threw him a set of striped prison pajamas that reeked of mold and the sweat of previous owners. The pants were comically short, ending mid-shin. The shirt was missing most of its buttons. Finally, leg irons were clicked shut around his ankles, connected by a heavy 18-inch chain that would become a permanent part of his existence. A guard marched him, his new chains clanking with each shuffling step, to New Guy Village. The cell block was a long, low concrete structure internally divided into a series of tiny, identical rooms. The guard unlocked a thick wooden door and shoved Harris violently inside. The cell was a mere 7 feet by 7 feet. A concrete platform, raised about a foot off the floor, extended from one wall, serving as his bed. A rusted metal bucket in the corner served as his latrine, its stench already overwhelming. The ceiling rose 12 feet high, crossed by a single dark beam. One small barred window was set near the ceiling, too high to reach, admitting only a single mocking shaft of dusty light. The walls were filthy concrete, stained with patches of black mold and other unidentifiable smears that Harris did not want to contemplate. Scratches marred every available surface. Names, dates, fragments of prayers. These were the ghosts of those who came before him. The door slammed shut with a sound of utter finality. A heavy bolt slid home on the other side. A profound silence descended, broken only by the persistent, lazy buzz of flies circling the waste bucket. Harris sat heavily on the concrete platform and took a mental and physical inventory. Bruised ribs that sent a jolt of pain with every breath. A swollen face, raw, bleeding cuts on his wrists from the rope, but he could move all his limbs. Nothing seemed broken, not yet. He was alive. For now, in this concrete box, that fact seemed almost irrelevant. The first night, Harris learned the macabre sounds of Hoa Lo. He learned to distinguish the sharp, rhythmic clap of guards' boot heels on concrete, a sound that always signaled danger. He learned the definitive boom of metal doors slamming shut, each one another soul entombed. Then, somewhere in the distance, a man began to scream. It was not a short cry of pain, but a prolonged, horrifying sound that went on for minutes that stretched like hours before it was cut off with shocking abruptness. Later, another scream started from a different direction, a different pitch of agony. Lying on the hard concrete platform, using his arm as a pillow, Harris realized with a cold certainty that the screams were coming from the interrogation rooms. They were torturing someone. Tomorrow or the day after, they would come for him. A single mosquito whined near his ear. He slapped at it in the dark and missed. The heat was suffocating even at night, the air thick, stagnant and motionless. Sweat pooled under his back, gluing the rough fabric of his pajamas to his skin. The leg irons, heavy and cold, chafed his ankles raw. He shifted his position slightly, and the chains rattled. The sound obscenely loud in the oppressive silence. He forced himself to lie perfectly still. In the darkness, he allowed himself to think about his wife Louise and their 2 young daughters back in California. They wouldn't know yet. The Air Force would dispatch a chaplain to inform Louise he was missing in action. She would not know if he was alive or dead, trapped in a nightmarish limbo. In a way, he thought with a pang of guilt, that ignorance might be a mercy. The interrogation came on the second day. 2 guards dragged Harris from his cell and took him to a room in Heartbreak Hotel. A North Vietnamese officer sat behind a simple wooden desk, flanked by stony-faced guards. The officer, small and wiry, spoke English with a noticeable French accent. "We can make this very easy or very difficult," he began without any preamble. He wanted military information, squadron tactics, future bombing targets, F-105 performance capabilities, radio frequencies. Harris stared back and gave the only answer he was permitted. Name, rank, serial number, date of birth, nothing more. The officer listened patiently, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to a guard. They forced Harris to his knees on a concrete floor that had been deliberately studded with sharp gravel. The pain was immediate and excruciating, sharp points digging into his kneecaps. An hour passed, then 2. When his body finally gave out and he collapsed, they beat him with thick rubber hoses that left deep, throbbing bruises but did not break the skin. They forced him into agonizing stress positions, arms raised high overhead until his shoulders burned, balancing on one leg, holding a squat with his back against a wall, as if sitting on an invisible chair. Whenever his screaming muscles failed and he fell, they beat him again. They used ropes to tie his arms behind his back in brutal configurations that forced his shoulders from their sockets. The pain was liquid fire, a white-hot agony that consumed everything. Harris passed out. They revived him with buckets of cold, brackish water and started the process again. Through it all, he clung to the 4 pillars of his resistance: name, rank, serial number, date of birth. They returned him to his cell, barely conscious, a broken heap of a man. But Hoa Lo had layers of torture that went far beyond the physical. The guards and interrogators were masters of psychological warfare. They ruthlessly isolated prisoners for weeks, sometimes months on end, understanding that without human contact, the mind begins to eat itself. They forbade all communication of any kind. The penalty for being caught talking, whispering, or even making eye contact with another prisoner was a severe beating, or worse. Harris crouched in his fetid cell for 16 hours a day during the hot season, let out only twice daily to empty his stinking waste bucket and splash filthy water on his face from a common cistern in the courtyard. The food, if it could be called that, arrived twice a day through a small slot in the thick wooden door. A bowl of watery soup with traces of rotting vegetables and a small sticky ball of rice. Sometimes the rice contained rocks that could crack a tooth. Sometimes it writhed with maggots. Harris ate it all anyway. Starvation was the only alternative. Within 3 weeks, he lost 20 pounds. His ribs began to show through his skin like a cage, and through it all, the leg irons remained locked on his ankles 24 hours a day, rusting in place from the humidity, rubbing his skin raw, and then into weeping sores that never healed in the pervasive filth. The days blurred into an indistinguishable, monotonous agony. Harris tried to mark time by scratching lines on the concrete wall with a small pebble he had found, but he soon lost count in his malnourished, exhausted state. Was that 30 days or 40? The relentless isolation fractured his sense of time itself until morning and night were the only reliable markers. To stave off madness, he began talking to himself just to hear the sound of a human voice, even if it was his own. He recited the Pledge of Allegiance, the Lord's Prayer, song lyrics from his youth, anything to prove to himself that he still existed, that his mind hadn't yet dissolved. But the suffocating silence of the prison always pressed back harder. Then, one morning, lying on his concrete slab, he heard something new, a sound from the adjacent cell. Tapping. It was rhythmic, deliberate, definitely not random. It came again, tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. A pattern. Someone was trying to communicate. Harris scrambled to the wall, his heart suddenly pounding. He listened intently. The tapping repeated, patient and clear. Hesitantly, he tapped back a few random times. An immediate response, 3 quick taps, a message, a code. But what code? Harris knew Morse, but this pattern was different, more complex. He pressed his ear hard against the cold, grimy concrete and concentrated, filtering out all other noise. The tapping continued, slow, patient, insistent. Tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 tap. Then silence, as if waiting for a response. Harris realized with a jolt of insight, someone wasn't just talking to him, someone was teaching him. Letter by letter, word by word, this was the tap code. A fellow prisoner in the adjacent cell was reaching out across yards of solid concrete and iron, defying the guards, risking unimaginable torture simply to make contact. In that instant, Harris was no longer alone. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow, like the first gasp of oxygen after nearly drowning. Other Americans were here. They were alive. They were resisting. They had created a secret language, a way to speak that the Vietnamese guards could not understand. Harris listened with desperate attention as his unknown neighbor began tapping slowly, methodically. The code was at once simple and brilliant, unbreakable without the key. It was based on a 5x5 grid of letters, with C and K sharing one square to fit the 26-letter alphabet into 25 spaces. Each letter was represented by 2 sets of taps, the first for its row, the second for its column. A was 1-1, tap, pause, tap. B was 1-2, tap, pause, tap, tap. M, in the middle of the grid, was 3-3, tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. The unseen tapper went through the entire alphabet, giving Harris time to visualize the grid and memorize each letter's coordinates. It took hours. Harris frequently forgot letters and had to ask for repeats by tapping back a single questioning tap. But slowly, painstakingly, letter by letter, he learned. That night, lying in the dark, he formed his first word back to the wall, Harris. The response came almost immediately, quick and confident. Welcome. Then a name, Shoemaker. Lieutenant Commander Robert Shoemaker, a Navy pilot shot down the previous year, one of the very first American POWs to be incarcerated at Hoa Lo. The man who had survived months alone in this hell and had emerged not broken, but with his mind intact enough to help create this incredible communication system. The silent, dead walls of Hoa Lo prison were suddenly, miraculously alive. Harris realized that the tapping he had heard on his first night, which he had dismissed as the noise of pipes or distant construction, had been messages. Hundreds of messages, constantly traveling through the concrete skeleton of the prison, prisoner to prisoner, cell to cell, building a vast invisible network the guards could not see or comprehend. The North Vietnamese certainly heard the tapping. They punished it viciously whenever they caught someone in the act, but they never understood what it meant. To them, it was just random noise, the sound of madness, prisoners finally going insane and banging on the walls. They did not realize, could not conceive, that the Americans had created an invisible command structure, a vibrant resistance network, a lifeline of communication that transformed Hoa Lu from a warehouse of isolated broken men into a unified, albeit captive, fighting force. That night, lying on his concrete platform with heavy leg irons cutting into his infected ankles, Captain Carlyle Harris tapped a message into the wall, his knuckles rapping against the concrete. Moments later, a response came back through the darkness. He was no longer a number. He was no longer alone. The war for him had entered a new clandestine phase, and deep in the walls of the Hanoi Hilton, the sound the guards dismissed as meaningless noise was actually the sound of men refusing to break. Welcome to the Hilton, April 1965, Hoa Lu Prison, Hanoi. The thick stone walls of the prison, grimly nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton by its first American inhabitants, suffocated all hope. Captain Carlyle Smitty Harris was thrown into a filthy, windowless cell, his world shrinking to stone, steel, and silence. The rules were brutal, no communication. Solitary confinement was the weapon used to break a man's spirit, to sever him from his comrades and his own identity. The interrogations were a relentless cycle of pain and psychological pressure, designed to extract military information and propaganda statements. Alone in the dark, hearing only the muffled sounds of other prisoners suffering the same fate, Harris knew that isolation was a more potent enemy than any guard. If they couldn't talk, they couldn't resist. If they couldn't resist, they were already lost. The days took shape around a rhythm designed to grind men down, a schedule Harris learned within 72 hours. At dawn, he heard the metallic scrape of bolts, the guards' boots echoing on stone. When his door opened, Harris stood facing the wall as required, hands behind his back, head down. A guard barked commands in Vietnamese. The rifle barrel prodding his spine made the meaning clear. He shuffled into the corridor with other prisoners, gaunt figures in loose-hanging striped pajamas, their eyes fixed on the stone floor. No one looked at anyone else. They formed a ragged line in the courtyard for roll call. A North Vietnamese officer walked the line, tapping a wooden baton against his palm. When he reached a prisoner who swayed from exhaustion, the baton cracked across the back of his knees. The American crumpled. Guards dragged him upright and forced him to stand. The officer continued without pause, calling out numbers. Harris was 47. He responded in Vietnamese, the single word drilled into him. The count finished, but they stood another 20 minutes in the humid heat while the officer read proclamations denouncing the American aggressors. Sweat ran down Harris's back, his broken ejection injuries throbbing. A man 3 positions down fainted. The guards let him lie in the dirt until the reading concluded. Work detail followed. Harris and others were marched to the eastern wall, where piles of brick and mortar waited. They were building new cell blocks to accommodate the flow of downed American airmen. The work, lifting, carrying, stacking, was mindless and brutal under the climbing sun. Harris's hands, once steady on a fighter stick, blistered and bled. His shoulders screamed. The supervising guard, a short, thick man the men called Piggy, watched with dead eyes, smoking cigarettes and shouting at anyone whose pace slowed. When one prisoner sat to rest, Piggy walked over and kicked him in the ribs. The man gasped, struggled upright, and resumed carrying bricks. They worked until noon, then filed to their cells for the day's single meal. A guard pushed a metal bowl through the door slot. Inside was a thin soup of rotted greens in tepid water, and a lump of bread stale enough to chip teeth. Harris forced it down. His body was consuming itself. He had lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks. The bread sat in his stomach like concrete, the soup doing nothing to stop the constant hunger. By the 3rd week, food was just fuel. Taste and texture ceased to matter. He ate what came through the slot, then lay on his wooden pallet, counting the hours until darkness. The interrogations punctuated the routine unpredictably. Guards came at any hour, dragging him to a room where an English-speaking officer sat behind a desk. The questions were always the same. They demanded his mission, targets, aircraft type, and carrier numbers. Harris gave only name, rank, service number, and date of birth. The interrogator's voice would grow sharp. The guards would move behind his chair. Then came the ropes. They bound his arms behind his back, cinched them tight, and yanked upward until his shoulders threatened to dislocate. The pain was all-consuming. Harris bit through his lip to keep from screaming. Afterward, back in his cell, he couldn't lift his arms for hours. After a month, Harris knew every crack in his cell walls. He learned the guards' habits, who limped, who smoked, who enjoyed the torture more than the others. He memorized the prison's rhythms, the interrogations, the guard rotations, the meal deliveries. His world had contracted to this stone box and its brutal routine. In early May, the guards moved Harris to a different section, a cell block the Americans called Heartbreak Hotel. The cells opened onto a narrow courtyard. Through the crack beneath his door, Harris could see slivers of the yard and watch the guards' boots on patrol. More importantly, he could hear other Americans. The walls were thick, but sound traveled. At night, he heard coughing, men moving on pallets, the shuffle of someone pacing. He wasn't completely alone anymore. The knowledge that other Americans were yards away, suffering the same hell, changed something fundamental. He began to listen carefully, trying to decode the sounds. One morning during the yard exercise, 15 minutes of walking in circles, Harris found himself behind a tall officer, Smitty Wells, a Navy lieutenant. They couldn't speak, but as they shuffled, Wells coughed twice, paused, coughed 3 times, paused, coughed once. The pattern repeated. Harris's mind, starved for stimulus, latched on. A code. The realization hit him like voltage. With a system, the isolation would break. They could share information, coordinate resistance, and maintain unit cohesion, remain a military force, not just broken individuals. Back in his cell, Harris experimented. Tapping the stone walls, floor, and door yielded only dull thuds. Then he noticed the ceramic drain pipe in the corner. Kneeling, he tapped its rim. The sound resonated. From somewhere in the plumbing, an answering tap. His pulse quickened. The pipes were an acoustic network. Sound moved through them like electricity through wire. Harris tapped deliberately. 1 tap, pause. 2 taps, pause. 3 taps. He waited. The response came back. 3, 2, 1. Someone was out there listening. During his next interrogation, Harris paid attention differently. While the interrogator droned on, Harris studied the room. Building a mental map of the prison, he noted the window's direction, the location of files, the guard rotation. When the ropes came out, when the pain tunneled his vision, Harris focused on the drain pipe, on the answering taps, on the knowledge that he wasn't alone. The pain remained absolute, but its power to break him diminished. He had something beyond himself to hold on to. By mid-June, Harris had identified 4 distinct tappers. One was methodical, patient. Another was frantic, tapping in irregular bursts. Morse code. The old system, obsolete in the jet age, was suddenly vital. Harris's academy. Morse was rusty. He knew only SOS and a few letters, not enough, but the methodical tapper seemed to be teaching. Every evening the lessons began. Simple patterns first, SOS, then individual letters, repeated slowly, A, B, C, patient instruction through ceramic pipe. Harris tapped back his attempts, got corrections, and learned. One morning in June's 3rd week, while hauling bricks, Harris noticed something. The new cell block's foundation ran parallel to the existing wall, leaving an 18-inch gap between old stone and new concrete, covered by planks. Piggy, the guard, was distracted. Harris glanced down into the gap. Darkness, an empty void running beneath the prison. He looked away, his mind racing. The prison sat on old French colonial foundations. Beneath it could be tunnels or forgotten chambers. The discovery aligned with a pattern Wells had coughed: Morse for basement. Harris had dismissed it as delirium, but now he understood. Wells knew something. That night, Harris tapped on his drain pipe. Slowly, he sent the Morse for basement ? After a long pause, the response came. Yes, basement, real. Then more tapping, faster than he could fully decode. But he caught certain letters clearly. Tunnel. His heart hammered. A tunnel. Somewhere in the Hanoi Hilton's foundations, someone was digging a way out. The isolation wasn't absolute. The walls weren't impenetrable. Men were already fighting back, not just surviving, but actively resisting, planning an escape. Harris lay on his pallet, listening to the guards' boots, the distant prison sounds, his own breathing. The routine was still brutal. The starvation, beatings, and rope torture would continue, but something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer just a prisoner trapped in a cell. He was part of a network, a communication system spreading through the prison like roots through concrete, unknown to the North Vietnamese. Somewhere beneath his feet, men were tapping out more than messages. They were tapping out an escape route, one careful strike at a time, while the guards walked overhead, hearing nothing. Their ignorance was the first crack in their control, the first weakness Harris could exploit. The walls had become instruments, carrying the rhythm of resistance through stone and pipe, connecting men who refused to be broken by silence. Harris tapped twice on his drain pipe before sleep. Somewhere in the network, someone tapped back. The conversation had begun. The spark in the dark, May 1965, Hoa Lo Prison. Captain Carlyle, Smitty Harris, pressed his knuckles against the rough concrete wall of his cell and tapped twice. The sound vanished into the thick stone like a whisper into a hurricane. He waited, counting heartbeats in the suffocating silence. Nothing. The isolation had become a physical presence in the cell, crushing him from all sides. 4 weeks of absolute silence, except for the guards' footsteps and the screams echoing from other parts of the Hanoi Hilton. 4 weeks of his own thoughts devouring themselves. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was the simple realization that he would go insane before he died if something didn't change. Death he could accept. Madness terrified him. The tap code surfaced in his memory like a life raft in dark water. 3 years earlier, at the Navy's SERE school in California, an instructor named Lieutenant Commander Denton had spent 20 minutes demonstrating it. Harris had sat in the back of that classroom, skeptical, wondering when he'd ever need to communicate through walls. The method was simple: a 5x5 grid containing the alphabet, with C and K sharing a space. Each letter required 2 numbers, row then column. The letter A was 1 tap, pause, 1 tap. B was 1 tap, pause, 2 taps. The instructor had made them practice briefly, then moved on to more pressing survival techniques. Harris remembered thinking it was a relic modern pilots would never need. Now that trivial piece of training represented his only chance at human connection. He studied the wall separating his cell from the adjacent one, solid concrete, 18 inches thick, coated with grime and decades of moisture. The Vietnamese guards called this block Heartbreak Hotel, and Harris understood why. The cells were 7 feet by 7 feet, barely large enough to lie down in. A concrete bed platform jutted from one wall. A waste bucket occupied one corner, emptied irregularly. The iron door had a small barred opening through which guards periodically peered, but this wall, this shared wall with his neighbor, offered possibility. Harris began practicing silently, his fingers ghosting over the concrete without making contact. Row 1, column 1, row 2, column 3, row 5, column 4. His mind constructed the grid, placing each letter in its square. a through E in the first row, F through J in the second, L through P in the third, remembering to combine C and K, Q through T in the fourth, U through Z in the fifth. The mental exercise felt almost normal, like studying navigation charts or weapon systems. Purpose replaced desperation, focus replaced madness, but practice wasn't enough. He needed to actually tap, to send a message into the wall, to see if anyone was there. The calculation froze him. Being caught communicating meant torture. The Vietnamese guards had made that abundantly clear during his initial interrogation. He still bore the bruises from the ropes that had wrenched his shoulders nearly out of their sockets. He'd watched guards beat other prisoners for infractions as minor as standing too slowly or making eye contact. What would they do if they caught him trying to organize resistance, trying to build an information network? The bamboo cane, the rope torture, the iron stocks, solitary confinement in the box, a space so small you couldn't straighten your legs. Yet the alternative was equally certain. The silence would destroy him. Already he'd begun talking to himself, arguing both sides of conversations, creating phantom companions. He'd started forgetting words, losing track of time, feeling his identity dissolving into the cell's oppressive emptiness. Some part of his mind, the pilot's mind, trained to calculate survival odds, knew he was approaching a point of no return. Act now while he still could, or surrender to the slow erosion of his sanity. Harris made his decision. He would start tonight, after the 2,200 hours guard check. He'd been timing the patrols, counting in his head to maintain some connection to structured time. The Vietnamese followed a predictable pattern. Checks at 0600, 1000, 1400, 1800 and 2200 hours. The longest gap came between the final evening check and dawn. That gave him 7 hours of relative safety, though safety was a generous term in the Hanoi Hilton. He waited on his concrete bed platform, knees pulled to his chest, conserving body heat in the tropical night that somehow always felt cold in this cell. His ears strained to identify every sound, boots on the corridor floor, keys rattling, the scrape of the vision port opening. A guard's eye appeared at Harris's door, visible only as a dark shape behind the bars. Harris remained motionless, appearing to sleep. The port closed. The footsteps continued down the corridor, checking each cell in sequence. Harris counted them off mentally. 12 cells in this block. The footsteps faded. A distant door clanged shut. Now. He had to do it now, before courage evaporated. Harris moved to the shared wall and placed his right hand flat against the concrete. The surface was cool, slightly damp, textured with imperfections. He formed his hand into a loose fist, knuckles extended. The message had to be simple, undeniable, not a random noise, but a clear signal. He chose the most basic of greetings, one that would confirm he was American, that he was alive, that he was reaching out. Tap, pause, tap, 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 G. He waited, controlling his breathing. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, O. His knuckles stung from the concrete's rough surface. Row 2, column 1, D. He spelled it out, letter by letter, each combination of taps deliberate and clear. God bless America. The silence that followed felt even deeper than before. Harris pressed his ear against the wall, listening so intently his skull ached. Nothing. He waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, counting slowly. Perhaps nobody was there. Perhaps the cell stood empty. Perhaps his neighbor was unconscious, or too terrified to respond, or too broken to care. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable. A responding tap pattern, tentative, unpracticed but following the code. Row 1, column 1, row 1, column 1, AA. The tapping continued. Row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2, AB. His neighbor was spelling out the alphabet, confirming they understood the system. Harris's chest constricted with an emotion he barely recognized anymore. Hope. Dangerous, fragile hope. The tapping stopped, then resumed with a message. GBU, God bless you. The sender struggled with the code, making occasional mistakes, repeating sequences, but the intent was clear. Someone was there, someone had heard him, someone was reaching back through the wall with the same desperate need for connection. Harris tapped back, WHORU, who are you? The response came slowly, laboriously. Row 5, column 4, Y, row 2, column 4. I. His neighbor spelled out a name letter by painful letter, Yingsty. First name came next, Robert. Captain Robert Yingst, Harris realized, an Air Force pilot he'd heard about shortly after his own capture. Yingst had been shot down 2 months before Harris in March. The communication was exhausting, each word requiring dozens of taps, each tap carrying the risk of discovery. But they persisted, establishing basic facts. Yingst confirmed 3 other Americans in adjacent cells within Heartbreak Hotel. He tapped out names: Stockdale, Denton, Rutledge. Harris felt his mental map expanding. He wasn't alone. None of them were alone anymore. The hours passed as they developed rhythm and efficiency with the code. Harris's knuckles began bleeding from the rough concrete, but he barely noticed. They shared critical information, interrogation techniques, guard schedules, names of other prisoners spotted during brief movements through the compound. Yingst reported that the Vietnamese were keeping senior officers separated, trying to prevent any organized resistance. They wanted each prisoner to believe he was alone, abandoned, forgotten. That isolation was a weapon, Harris now understood. The Vietnamese had studied this. They knew that physical torture had limits. You could only break so many bones, inflict so much pain before the body shut down. But psychological torture, the torture of silence and loneliness, had no such limits. It compounded daily, breaking the mind rather than the body. The tap code was resistance against that weapon. Each message, each confirmation of another American's existence, rebuilt what isolation tried to destroy. Near dawn, exhausted, Harris tapped a final message. Will tap 2300 tomorrow. Spread the code. Yingst confirmed. Will tell others. Keep faith. The communication ended. Harris returned to his bed platform and lay down, his bleeding knuckles throbbing. The cell looked exactly the same. Same walls, same bucket, same dim light beginning to filter through the high-barred window. But everything had changed. He was no longer an isolated prisoner waiting to be broken. He was part of a network, a resistance organization building itself tap by tap through concrete walls. The Vietnamese guards would hear the tapping. They had to eventually. The walls were too thin. The code too widespread once it started multiplying between cells, but they wouldn't understand what it meant. They'd hear rhythmic sounds, prisoners fidgeting against walls, the ambient noise of confinement. They'd never realize they were listening to the architecture of defiance being constructed around them. Harris examined his hands in the growing light. Blood had dried in dark streaks across his knuckles. The skin was torn and raw. He would need to pace himself, develop calluses, find ways to muffle the sound while keeping it audible to his neighbors. Technical problems, solvable problems, the kind of challenges a pilot could analyze and overcome. He felt his mind sharpening, focusing, returning from the edge of dissolution. He had purpose again. He had a mission: maintain communication, expand the network, deny the enemy their weapon of isolation. The morning guard check came at 0600. The vision port scraped open. Harris kept his hands hidden, maintaining the appearance of broken compliance. The guard's eyes surveyed the cell, finding nothing amiss. The port closed, but Harris knew something the guard didn't. The wall behind him now contained something invisible but transforming, proof that Americans were still Americans, that rank still mattered, that resistance was possible even in 7-by-7-foot concrete boxes in the heart of enemy territory. The code would spread cell to cell, block to block, building an invisible communications network the Vietnamese couldn't see and couldn't stop without rebuilding their entire prison. By the time they understood what the tapping meant, it would already be too late. The foundation had been laid in the dark, and nothing they did now could tear it down. Harris waited for nightfall to come again, already composing his next message, already planning how to teach the code to whoever occupied the cells above and below his own. The spark had caught. Now it needed to spread. Chapter 4. The First Word. June 1965, Hoa Lo Prison. Captain Smitty Harris pressed his ear to the cold concrete wall separating his cell from his neighbors. He began to tap, deliberately. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, 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 tap. The letter E, then A, then T. He tapped out the simplest, most vital question one prisoner could ask another. Eat. He waited, heart pounding in the oppressive silence. He feared the man next door was too broken, too scared, or didn't understand. Then a faint, clumsy scratching returned through the wall. The prisoner, Lieutenant Commander Robert Shoemaker, was trying to respond. Working together, tap by scratch, they established the system. Soon, Harris taught Shoemaker the full code. They were no longer alone. They had broken the silence. A weapon of resistance, more powerful than any a guard could confiscate, was born. The communication spread like electricity through dead wires. Harris knew one connection meant nothing if it died between two cells. Proliferating the weapon required more than tapping. It required trust decisions that could end in torture chambers. Every prisoner recruited was a gamble. Every teaching session a roll of the dice with death. Harris chose his next student during a rare moment in the washing area. Commander Jeremiah Denton, shot down 3 months after Harris, stood at the concrete trough, his eyes hollow but alert. A senior Navy pilot, he remained unbroken despite interrogations that left his hands shaking. Harris memorized the guard's patrol, counted the seconds, and leaned close while scrubbing. His lips barely moved. Wall tap, 5 by 5. Learn it. Denton's eyes flickered in acknowledgement. 3 days later, from Denton's new cell, came 5 deliberate taps, the question mark, signaling he was ready. Harris taught him in 20-minute sessions over 2 weeks. Every tap, a risk a guard's ear might press against the opposite side. They worked during the loudest moments, when food carts rattled through corridors or guards shouted during shift changes. Denton learned fast, and within days was teaching the man in the cell beyond his. The network grew through calculated risk as each prisoner assessed the men around them. Navy Commander James Stockdale, the senior ranking officer after his shoot-down in September 1965, became a critical node. Stockdale instantly understood what the tap code represented, not just communication, but military organization reconstituted through concrete walls. He began treating it as a command structure, passing orders, maintaining discipline, and coordinating resistance. The code allowed him to lead men he couldn't see, to command a unit that existed only in sound waves traveling through stone. But growth brought danger. Informers existed in every prison. Hanoi placed Vietnamese prisoners posing as Americans in cells to extract information, and some real Americans, broken by torture, bought better treatment with intelligence. Spreading the tap code required vetting each man with questions only Americans could answer. Sports scores, hometowns, aircraft carrier names, childhood television shows. This authentication occurred in whispers during forced labor or in the first taps through a wall, coded questions probing for truth before the real teaching began. Close calls mounted as the network expanded. In August 1965, a guard heard tapping from Navy Lieutenant Philip Butler's cell during a surprise inspection. Butler sat motionless, hands visible, face blank. The guard pressed his ear to the wall, listening. The tapping continued from the adjacent cell, where Air Force Captain Robert Peel hadn't heard the guard enter. The guard's hand moved toward his whistle. Butler coughed, a loud, racking sound doubling over. The guard's attention snapped to him, suspicion mixing with disgust. Butler coughed again, spitting onto the floor, buying precious seconds. The tapping stopped. Peel had heard the cough and understood the warning. The guard stared at Butler, then at the wall, and back again. He kicked Butler's water bucket across the cell and left. Butler's hands didn't stop shaking for an hour. The psychological weight of maintaining the network crushed as much as it sustained. Every tap carried the possibility of discovery, and every man who learned the code became responsible for dozens of others. If torture broke one man, and he revealed the system, reprisals, isolation, rope torture, leg irons would sweep through the prison. The code connected them, but that connection created a terrible vulnerability. Yet they continued, for the code provided something more vital than safety, purpose. Men dying of dysentery tapped medical advice through walls. Prisoners returning from rope torture, shoulders dislocated, tapped defiance to the men next door. They shared intelligence on guard patterns, warned of impending torture, and coordinated responses to interrogations. When guards forced them to write propaganda, the tap code coordinated unified refusal. When isolation threatened to break minds, the code was proof that others remained, that resistance endured, that surrender was not an option. The teaching method evolved through trial and error. The 5x5 matrix was simple. A grid of letters excluding K, C was used instead. The first number of taps indicated the row, the second the column. 2 taps, pause, 3 taps meant H. Teaching required more than explaining the grid. It required drilling until decoding became automatic, even when exhausted, starving, or beaten. Harris and the early users developed training sequences, starting with common words like eat, sick, guard, yes, and no, before moving to names and sentences. Teachers patiently corrected mistakes through the walls, repeating sequences to build speed and accuracy. Physical preparation became part of survival. Fingers calloused from tapping against concrete. Men learned to tap with knuckles, cups, or spoons, anything to make sound without destroying hands already damaged by torture and malnutrition. They developed techniques for different wall types, using harder strikes for thick concrete and delicate touches for thin partitions to avoid detection. They learned to tap low, where guards wouldn't notice, or high, where sound traveled better. The code adapted to the prison's architecture. By late 1965, the network connected more than 30 prisoners across Hoa Lo's cell blocks. Commander Stockdale, through walls and whispered words, began issuing orders: resist propaganda, maintain military discipline, follow the code of conduct. The tap code allowed him to enforce these commands and maintain unit cohesion. When guards forced prisoners to bow, Stockdale's orders travelled through the walls. Bow minimally, resist where possible, never voluntarily show deference. The prisoners, isolated in stone boxes, functioned as a military unit again. But the North Vietnamese weren't blind. Guards heard rhythmic noises from cells that should hold silent, broken men. In November 1965, they began sweeping cell blocks with increased frequency, listening at walls and watching prisoners through peepholes. The network adapted. Lookouts developed warning systems. A cough meant a guard was approaching. A cleared throat meant danger was close. Silence meant it was safe to communicate. The prisoners became an orchestra and conductor simultaneously, each man listening for cues while tapping his part. The strain showed on every prisoner. They were starving, diseased, and beaten regularly. Dysentery left them weak, infected wounds festered without treatment, and tropical heat turned cells into ovens. They should have focused solely on survival, but instead spent precious energy tapping messages, teaching new prisoners, and maintaining a communication network that provided no food or medicine. The code gave them something else: the ability to remain soldiers instead of becoming victims. December 1965 brought the first major test. Guards discovered marks on cell walls from tapping. Interrogations intensified as they demanded to know what the sounds meant. Prisoners claimed ignorance, blaming rats or loose pipes. Torture sessions grew longer. Men returned to their cells with dislocated shoulders and swollen faces, unable to tap for days, but no one revealed the code. The network held. When guards finally gave up, frustrated, the tapping resumed, quieter, more careful, but unbroken. The code allowed for coordination impossible in previous wars. When guards moved Air Force Major Lawrence Guarino to a punishment cell to break him with isolation, he found the wall. Within hours, he was tapping and reconnected to the network. The isolation cell failed because it couldn't truly isolate. Guarino received orders from Stockdale and sent reports on guard movements, maintaining his role in the unit despite walls designed to erase him. The prison's architecture, meant to separate, became the medium for resistance. By early 1966, the guards knew something existed but couldn't identify it. The tap code's simplicity made it nearly invisible. There was no physical evidence, no written messages to discover, no contraband to confiscate, just sound gone the instant it was made. The guards searched cells, stripped prisoners, and studied walls, but found nothing conclusive. The code existed in the spaces between their understanding, a resistance network built from mathematics and determination. New arrivals, shot down in increasing numbers, entered the prison and found the network waiting. Within days of capture, after being thrown into dark cells designed to destroy hope, they heard tapping. The sound meant they weren't alone. That organization persisted, that the enemy hadn't won. Air Force Captain John Dramisi, shot down in April 1967, heard his first tap hours after his cell door locked. The message was simple. "What your name?" He tapped back, and the network absorbed him. Within a week, he knew the system. Within 2, he was teaching the next man to arrive. The code created accountability. Prisoners couldn't hide in isolation or make individual decisions that compromised the group. Stockdale's orders traveled through walls. Make no propaganda statements, cooperate only with name, rank, serial number, and date of birth, and follow the code of conduct. When torture pushed men toward breaking points, the knowledge that the unit would know provided the strength to hold on. The walls that separated them became the medium that bound them. By June 1967, 2 years after Harris first tapped EAT, the network connected over 100 prisoners. As the Vietnamese moved captives between facilities like Camp Unity and the Zoo, the code traveled with them. New prisons meant new walls, new risks, and new connections. Guards still heard tapping and punished prisoners when caught, but they never understood what moved through their walls. They never realized that the scattered, defeated prisoners they thought they controlled were a military unit communicating through mathematics, maintaining resistance through sound. The weapons Smitty Harris created from a childhood memory and desperate need became the backbone of organized resistance in North Vietnamese prisons. Every new prisoner learned it. Every cell connected to it. Every order, piece of intelligence, and word of encouragement traveled via tap code. The guards heard sounds in the walls and dismissed them as rats, pipes, or old buildings settling. They never realized it was an entire military command structure built from taps against concrete, maintained by men who refused to be silenced, connecting hundreds of prisoners through walls designed to separate them forever. Chapter 5. The Unseen Network, 1966 to 1967, Hoa Lo Prison. The guards began noticing oddities. Prisoners coughed in rhythmic patterns. A broom sweep had a strange cadence. A bucket would clank a specific number of times. They heard faint tapping from the walls, but could never pinpoint the source or decipher its meaning. The tap code, originating from the cell of Captain Smitty Harris, was spreading like a virus. As prisoners were moved, they became disciples, teaching the code to their new cellmates. Soon, the entire POW population of the Hanoi Hilton was connected by an invisible web. They shared intelligence, coordinated resistance during interrogations, warned of guard rotations, and, most importantly, maintained a military command structure. When a new shoot-down arrived, a welcoming committee would tap him the essentials for survival. The North Vietnamese were mystified and enraged. They controlled the bodies, but the minds, linked together, were slipping through their fingers. Lieutenant Commander John McCain arrives at Hoa Lo in October 1967, badly injured from his shoot-down, both arms broken, right knee shattered, bayonet wound in his ankle. He's thrown into a cell in the section prisoners call Heartbreak Hotel. He lies on a concrete slab, barely conscious, infection spreading through his wounds. He is alone. The pain is absolute. He drifts in and out of awareness, unsure he would survive the night. Then he hears it. 5 distinct taps on the wall. Pause. 3 more taps. Pause. 1 tap. Pause. 1 tap. Pause. 3 taps. He doesn't understand. The pattern repeats. 53113. His fever-addled mind processes the sound. Not random, deliberate. Someone is communicating. He tries to lift a broken arm to respond, but the pain drops him into darkness. When consciousness returns, the tapping continues. Patient, methodical. McCain taps 2 uncertain knocks back with his foot. The response is immediate. A flurry of taps organized into groups. Then a slower sequence begins. The pattern repeats for hours. Through his delirium, he recognizes a structure, a 5x5 grid of letters. The first taps indicate the row, the second the letter's position, the alphabet -K, which shares a cell with C. His neighbor teaches him the code through repetition. GBU. God bless you. The message hits him like electricity. He is not alone. Broken and infected, he is connected to fellow prisoners. He taps back clumsily with his foot. THX, thanks. The wall erupts in tapping laughter. Nearby prisoners are all listening, celebrating the newest member of their invisible network. McCain has joined the resistance. The courtyard guards notice nothing unusual. They hear the rhythmic tapping that echoes through Heartbreak Hotel, Little Vegas, and Camp Unity, but they cannot isolate the source. Sound bounces off concrete walls in unpredictable ways. One guard rushes to cell 7, certain the tapping originates there. He peers through the peephole. The prisoner sits motionless on his bunk, hands in his lap, staring at nothing. The tapping continues from somewhere else. He moves to cell 9. The prisoner is still, yet the tapping persists, seeming to come from the next cell or across the courtyard. The guards grow frustrated. They know the Americans are communicating. The evidence is everywhere. Prisoners return from interrogation resisting in coordinated ways, refusing the same questions. They mouth the national anthem during propaganda filming, synchronized despite separation by walls. They maintain rank structure despite Vietnamese efforts to break it. Senior officers command, junior officers obey. The invisible network undermines every attempt at total control. Camp Officer Soft Soap Fairy, named for his gentle interrogation approach, becomes obsessed with breaking the code. He orders random cell searches for written instructions or carved messages. The searches yield nothing. The code exists only in minds and on walls, transmitted through vibrations that leave no trace. He orders prisoners placed in leg stocks during the day to prevent them from tapping with their feet. The tapping continues through knuckles, elbows, even foreheads pressed against walls. He orders extended periods of silence, threatening severe punishment for any noise. The prisoners obey during inspections, then resume the moment guards step away. The tapping grows softer, but never stops. Soft Soap Fairy brings in technical advisors who attempt to map the sound patterns. They place ears against walls, trying to decode the sequences. But without the key, the tap code is impenetrable. To untrained ears, the pattern seems random. The advisors give up after weeks of effort. The commandant's fury grows. He increases punishment for suspected communication. Cat, the camp's most brutal interrogator, focuses his torture on extracting the code. He binds prisoners in ropes until circulation stops, demands they reveal the system. Most prisoners, when broken past endurance, claim they are simply tapping nervously, a habit from stress. Some admit to a code, but give false systems, misdirecting interrogators on futile searches. The North Vietnamese fought an unseen enemy, using a language they couldn't speak, via a medium they couldn't stop. Concrete walls, meant to isolate, had become the prisoners' greatest communications asset. Inside Cell 24 in Little Vegas, Air Force Major George Coker receives a message through the wall that changes everything. The taps spell out coordinates and timing for a possible extraction attempt. Guards have noticed reduced patrols in the northeast section between 0200 and 0400 hours. A work detail discovered the outer wall has a weak point near the kitchen annex. The information comes from multiple sources, prisoners in different sections sharing observations that, when combined, create a tactical picture. Coker taps acknowledgement and adds his own intelligence. From his cell window, he has observed the guard rotation schedule. The newest guards, less experienced, take the dawn shift. They are often drowsy, sometimes falling asleep at their posts. He has seen one guard leave his station entirely to smoke behind the latrine building. These tiny fragments of information flow through the walls, shared across the network, building towards something larger. The senior ranking officer in the camp, Navy Commander James Stockdale, receives all intelligence through the Tapcode network. Though confined in solitary in the punishment section called Alcatraz, he remains in command through the walls. His orders tap outward through the prison. No escape attempts during this period. The risk is too high. The reprisals would be catastrophic. Focus on survival and resistance. Maintain the chain of command. Stockdale's guidance spreads through 50 cells in less than an hour. Prisoners who have never seen him, who don't know what he looks like, follow his commands absolutely. The tap code has preserved military order in chaos. When new shootdowns arrive, disoriented and terrified, the welcoming committee springs into action. The moment a prisoner is locked into a cell, the tapping begins. Slow at first, patient, teaching the code through repetition. Within days, sometimes hours, the new arrival is connected. He learns who else is held in his section. He learns the rules of survival. Never give more than name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. Resist interrogation as long as possible. When torture becomes unbearable and you must speak, give false information or outdated intelligence. Return to resistance as soon as possible. Forgive yourself for breaking. Everyone breaks eventually. The network absolves and supports. It transforms isolated suffering into collective resistance. The code evolves beyond simple messages. Prisoners develop abbreviated versions for speed. Common phrases receive shorthand designations. GN means good night. GBU remains God bless you, tapped between cells every evening. CU means church call, the signal for silent prayer at agreed times, connecting prisoners in worship despite separation. The network coordinates religious services that the North Vietnamese never detect. Every Sunday at 1000 hours, prisoners across the camp recite the Lord's Prayer silently in their cells, synchronized through prior tapped coordination. They are worshipping together, a congregation separated by concrete but unified in spirit. The guards walk past cells at 1000 hours every Sunday, seeing only solitary prisoners sitting quietly, never realizing a church service fills the entire prison. The tap code transmits poetry. Air Force Captain James Stockdale, a literature scholar before his shootdown, taps out verses from memory. Invictus spreads through the cells, the words of William Ernest Henley becoming an anthem of resistance. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Prisoners memorize it through repeated tappings, then tap it forward to the next cell. The poem circles the entire camp within a week. During brutal interrogation sessions, when Cat or Soft Soap Fairy or any of the other interrogators demand capitulation, prisoners recite the words internally. I am the master of my fate. The North Vietnamese control their bodies, chain them, torture them, starve them. But the TAP code has created a fortress of the mind that no interrogation can penetrate. The invisible network grows stronger with each passing month. By late 1967, nearly every American prisoner in Hoa Lo prison is connected. The code has spread to the outlying camps as prisoners are transferred. Plantation Gardens receives the code from a transferred prisoner within days of his arrival. Camp Faith learns it from a prisoner moved during punishment redistribution. The TAP code becomes the voice of American resistance across North Vietnam, a silent shout of defiance that the guards hear constantly but cannot silence. The North Vietnamese realize they are losing a war they didn't know they were fighting. They control every physical aspect of imprisonment. They decide food rations, sleeping arrangements, punishment schedules. But the Americans have built a parallel command structure, invisible and untouchable, that undermines every attempt at complete domination. The prisoners tap through the night, messages flowing from cell to cell, building to building, camp to camp, intelligence shared, orders given, encouragement offered, faith maintained. The concrete walls that should isolate have become conductors of solidarity. The North Vietnamese have imprisoned the bodies, but the TAP code has freed the minds, connecting them in an unbreakable network of resistance that will sustain them through years of captivity still to come. 5 taps, 3 taps, the code continues. Chapter 6, We Tap to Live, 1967-1973, all POW camps in North Vietnam. The TAP code became the lifeblood of the American POWs. For 8 torturous years, Captain Carlyle, Smitty Harris and his comrades used it to endure what was designed to be unendurable. Men who never saw each other's faces for years became best friends, tapping out their life stories through the walls. Senior officers like James Stockdale used the code to issue orders and reinforce the code of conduct, ensuring the men resisted as a unified force. It allowed them to share prayers, tell jokes, and mourn fallen comrades together, even in solitary. The code was their shield against despair and their primary tool of defiance. When the war finally ended and Operation Homecoming began in February 1973, men who had only ever known each other as a series of taps through a wall finally met face to face on the tarmac. Smitty Harris, after nearly 8 years in captivity, walked out as a survivor whose simple, ingenious act of resistance had saved countless minds, if not lives. By late 1972, the TAP code network spanned every major POW camp in North Vietnam: the Hanoi Hilton, Briar Patch, the Zoo, Alcatraz, the Plantation, connecting hundreds of men through concrete and brick. The guards heard the constant tapping but dismissed it as plumbing noises or madness, never comprehending the intricate web of communication happening beneath their noses. From isolation, and despite repeated torture, senior ranking officer James Stockdale tapped policy decisions that reached every American prisoner. The code carried his orders: resist, unity over self, we return with honor. When guards forced confessions, the TAP code allowed men to warn each other, share interrogation techniques, and reinforce that compliance under torture was not betrayal, saving them from destructive guilt. The network came alive with spiritual sustenance. The Lord's Prayer traveled cell to cell each morning. On Sundays, chaplains tapped entire sermons to unseen congregations. On Christmas Eve 1971, Silent Night passed through every cell block in the Hanoi Hilton, a hymn the Vietnamese could not silence. The code was also a lifeline for the mind. Jokes, dirty limericks, and entire baseball games recreated play-by-play from memory were tapped through walls. Men conducted trivia contests and spelling bees, anything to keep their minds sharp against the rot of isolation. When Bob Shoemaker mentally recited every state capital, he tapped the achievement to his wallmate, who promptly started testing him on world capitals. The challenge spread, turning mental exercise into a group sport, but the tap code's greatest power lay in the simple act of presence. When Navy pilot Charlie Plum entered solitary confinement in a cell so small he could not fully extend his legs, the first thing he heard was the shave and a haircut knock. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. Then the question spelled out, GBU, God bless you, who are you? He tapped back his name and squadron. The response from the other side of the wall, WELCOMEHOME. Plum wept. He was not alone. The walls were full of friends he hadn't yet met. They tapped their life stories through long nights. Jerry Coffey described his California childhood, his wedding, the birth of his children. His wallmate, Bud Day, responded with his own memories, the two men sharing everything but physical presence. When a letter informed Coffey his wife was pregnant with their third child, he tapped the news immediately. Congratulations rippled through the block as 40 men celebrated a birth they would never witness, tapping jokes about diapers. Coffey later called it the most wonderful baby shower in history. The Vietnamese launched periodic purges against the code. Guards would burst into cells demanding to know who was tapping, and the beatings were severe. Men were tortured with ropes until their shoulders dislocated or locked in leg stocks for weeks. But the code never stopped. It merely paused. The North Vietnamese could not be everywhere at once, and the prisoners exploited this tactical reality. When one communication route was discovered, others opened. For 4 years, Air Force Captain Conrad Troutman was in a cell where he could see no other American, but he could tap. The man in the next cell became his best friend. Tapping daily for 3 years, they came to know each other's parents' names, first girlfriends, and dreams for after the war. They planned future fishing trips and described favorite meals in excruciating detail, a mutual torture and comfort. When Troutman was finally moved to a different cell, he tapped goodbye to a man whose face he had never seen. He tapped ILOVEYOUBROTHER. The response came immediately, SAMESEEYOUSTATESIDE. The code carried news from the outside world, delivered by new shoot-downs. In 1969, a new captive tapped the astonishing news: Americans had landed on the moon. The message spread through the Hanoi Hilton within hours. Men wept with pride, tapping out mock ticker tape parades through the walls. Stockdale tapped a formal announcement: American technology and courage have achieved the impossible. Remember what we represent. Guards noticed the increased tapping, but attributed it to agitation, never suspecting the prisoners were celebrating an American triumph. When a battered Air Force Major Leo Thorsness arrived in 1967, the first sound he heard through his wall was the tap code. At first, the sequence seemed random. Then he realized someone was teaching him. Patiently, the taps came. Tap, tap for A, tap, 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 tap for E, repeated until he understood. Within 2 weeks, Thorsness was communicating. Within a month, he was fluent. Soon, he was teaching new arrivals himself. The knowledge spread like a virus the Vietnamese could not quarantine. The network also shared life-saving intelligence. Warnings about prisoner movements or planned torture sessions tapped through the walls in advance, allowing men to prepare mentally. When the Vietnamese selected men for early release as a propaganda ploy, senior officers tapped orders to refuse. The men complied, rejecting freedom to maintain unit cohesion. The code made such coordination possible, ensuring they faced every decision as one. Navy Commander Jeremiah Denton endured some of the worst torture of the war, hung from ceiling hooks and beaten with fan belts. Yet between sessions, he tapped. He sent Shakespearean sonnets, the Gettysburg Address, and dirty jokes that coaxed laughter from miserable men. His gift was stubborn, morale-boosting communication. When guards threatened to kill him if he didn't stop, Denton tapped louder. They beat him unconscious. When he awoke, he began tapping again. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. As news trickled into the camps, the tap code carried cautious hope through every cell block. Men who had been friends for years via tapping now faced meeting in person. The excitement was mixed with anxiety. Would the friendships forged through walls survive in the physical world? On February the 12th, 1973, Operation Homecoming began. As the first group of POWs boarded buses at the Hanoi Hilton, Smitty Harris sat skeletal, wearing the flight suit he was captured in nearly 8 years before. Around him sat men he knew intimately, but had never seen. The man next to him tapped on the bus seat. SMITTYQMARK. Harris turned and looked into the face of his wallmate of 4 years. They had tapped thousands of conversations. Now looking at each other, neither could speak. They embraced and wept. As the bus rolled toward Carlyle Airport, men tapped on every surface, knees, seats, windows. They tapped jokes, prayers of thanks, and the simple message, WEMADEIT, at Carlyle Airport. The C-141 Starlifter waited, an American flag on its tail. The POWs filed across the tarmac, each man stopping to salute the American officer at the aircraft stairs. They were being filmed for North Vietnamese propaganda, but the Americans didn't care. They were going home. Smitty Harris's legs barely supported him as he climbed the stairs. Inside, he collapsed into a seat as medical staff began assessing the years of damage, dehydration, malnutrition, untreated injuries. But Harris was looking around the cabin at faces he recognized only from tapped conversations through concrete walls. Air Force Major Sam Johnson sat 3 rows ahead. They had tapped to each other for 6 years. Harris tapped on the armrest, SAM. Johnson turned, saw Harris, and broke into a smile, missing several teeth. He tapped back on his own armrest, BROTHER. As the C-141's engines roared to life, the men began tapping on the fuselage walls, the entire aircraft becoming a tap code network one last time, repeating the same message, GOINGHOME. When the wheels left Vietnamese soil, a cheer erupted that shook the aircraft. Men embraced, laughed, and wept. The code was no longer necessary for survival, but old habits persisted. Throughout the flight to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, men tapped messages to each other even though they could speak freely. It was their language of resistance, and letting it go felt like losing part of themselves. At Clark, the medical teams were overwhelmed. They saw men who should have weighed 200 pounds weigh 120, their bodies covered in scars, their hair prematurely white. But the doctors also witnessed a unit cohesion, unlike anything in military history. The men functioned as a single organism, checking on comrades before accepting their own treatment. They knew each other's medical needs and family situations, despite many meeting for the first time. The tap code had built bonds stronger than sight. During his debriefing, intelligence officers wanted to know about camp conditions and torture methods. The first thing Smitty Harris told them about was the tap code. He explained the grid, and the officers were stunned. For 8 years, an entire communication network had operated under the enemy's nose, coordinating resistance and preventing psychological collapse. The military immediately began studying the code for future applications, but Harris knew its real value wasn't tactical, it was human. It gave men connection in a system designed for isolation, a voice when silence was a weapon, and community when loneliness was torture. The code kept them American, sane, and alive. In the following years, POW reunions became sacred events, where men who had only known each other through walls finally spent time together. Harris met dozens of men who had learned the code from others, a chain of communication stretching back to the grid he first taught Bob Shoemaker. The code had saved hundreds. Harris received numerous official medals, but the one he valued most was unofficial, a plaque from his fellow POWs inscribed with the tap code grid and the words, "You gave us voices." The TAP code was formally incorporated into SERE school. Harris, now an old man, would occasionally lecture there, demonstrating the simple grid that had changed history. He always ended the same way. He would tap on the podium, "GBU, God bless you," and then tell the students what he'd told prisoners through concrete walls for 8 years. "You are not alone. You will never be alone. The walls are full of friends you haven't met yet. Keep tapping, keep fighting, keep faith." The code was more than communication. It was proof that the human spirit cannot be isolated into submission, and that connection will find a way through any barrier. The sound that traveled through the Hanoi Hilton was more than letters. It was love. It was defiance. For 8 years, the North Vietnamese heard tapping and dismissed it as noise. They never realized it was the sound of Americans refusing to surrender, one tap at a time. Chapter 7. The Code's Legacy, post-1973. Upon his return, Colonel Carlyle Smitty Harris received the Air Force Cross for heroism as a POW, but his greatest legacy proved to be institutional. The story of the TAP code's success spread throughout the US military, becoming a central and mandatory part of survival, evasion, resistance, and escape SERE training for all high-risk personnel. Generations of pilots, special forces, and intelligence officers would learn the 5x5 grid Harris introduced at the Hanoi Hilton. His memoir, A TAP Code, co-written with his wife, became a definitive account of psychological survival. Unlike tales of physical escape, Harris's contribution was a testament to communication and the resilience of the human spirit. Harris landed at Clark Air Base in the Philippines on February 12, 1973, weighing 140 pounds. Down from the 185 he weighed upon entering Hoa Lo prison. His body bore the marks of his ordeal: chronic dysentery, untreated fractures in both hands from torture, and dental damage requiring 18 months of reconstructive work. But what struck the debriefers who interviewed him wasn't his physical state. It was the organizational chart he drew entirely from memory, detailing names, cell locations, torture dates, guard routines, and communication networks. He had mentally catalogued 2,843 days of imprisonment with a filing clerk's precision. The intelligence officers had never seen anything like it. When one captain asked how he maintained such recall, Harris tapped his knuckle against the metal desk 5 times. Pause 3 times. The captain was perplexed. Harris smiled for the first time since landing. "That's how," he said. The Clark debriefing files, classified secret for 27 years, revealed the TAP code's immense intelligence value upon their release in 2000. By late 1970, Harris and his fellow POWs had used the system to compile a complete roster of American prisoners in North Vietnam, tracking who was moved, who had died, and who was isolated for resistance. When 1972 peace negotiations stalled over prisoner accounting, US negotiators possessed intelligence Hanoi didn't know they had. The North Vietnamese claimed 368 prisoners. The TAP code network had identified 487. This discrepancy forced Hanoi to acknowledge holding men they had previously denied capturing. Harris's knuckles against cell walls created the most accurate POW database of the war, not through interrogation, but through communication the enemy never detected. Returning to active duty in June 1973, Harris declined a Pentagon staff position, requesting instead an assignment with the Air Training Command to teach survival. The Air Force approved, on the condition that he first spend 6 months as a student, not an instructor, in the newly redesigned Code of Conduct course at Fairchild Air Force Base. The military was overhauling resistance training post-Vietnam. While Harris's experience would inform the new curriculum, he first had to understand its institutional framework. Arriving at Fairchild in August 1973, his first class session began with an instructor writing the 5x5 grid on a chalkboard. "Gentlemen, "This is the tap code," the instructor announced. "All of you will master it before you leave." From the back row, Harris sat quietly, not raising his hand, as the man explained the system he had invented in a cell 8 years earlier. The silence following Harris's return was typical for POWs. After brief celebrations for the 591 men of Operation Homecoming, America, eager to move on from a war that ended badly, largely forgot them. POW stories faded from headlines within months. Harris granted only 3 interviews in 1973, all to military publications, declining civilian media. His family observed that he rarely spoke of the camps, and only in vague terms. His wife, Carlyle Louise, knew he had been tortured, but didn't learn the specifics until reading his Air Force Cross citation 18 months after his return. It mentioned extraordinary resistance, but omitted the ropes that dislocated his shoulders or the bamboo cane that fractured his hands. The full truth emerged during a VA hospital visit in 1975 for chronic pain. When a physician asked about scars on his upper arms, Harris described the rope torture technique. Carlyle Louise was in the room, hearing him describe it for the very first time. Harris retired from the Air Force in 1992 after 28 years. By then, the TAP code was standard curriculum at all SERE schools. Yet his role in its creation remained known only to military insiders and the POW community. The public knew of the Great Escape or the Sun Tay raid, but Harris's story was buried in classified files and training manuals. He didn't mind. After years of avoiding guards, anonymity felt natural. This forgetting wasn't malicious, but structural. The SERE curriculum taught the code as a system developed by American POWs, divorcing it from its creator. Harris's specific contribution was subsumed into the collective POW experience. Even historians in the 1980s, focused on torture and escape, deemed communication systems uncompelling. One book, after an interview where Harris emphasized the code, relegated it to a single paragraph in a chapter on captivity, failing even to include his name in the index. His fellow POWs, however, never forgot. The tight-knit non-POWs community maintained contact through reunions. There, men who had been his neighbors through prison walls would find Harris to thank him, sometimes tapping THNX on banquet tables. He would simply nod. The community knew his role, but they were a quiet group. For many, post-traumatic stress was a private burden, and talking about captivity meant reliving it. Most chose silence. In 1995, Carlyle Louise Harris began urging her husband to write his story. Having seen him captivate his Sunday school class, she believed his experience needed to be shared. Harris resisted, not considering himself a writer, but she persisted. After securing an agent who insisted on a co-author, Carlyle Louise volunteered for the role. With no experience beyond church newsletters, but an intimate knowledge of her husband's voice, she was the perfect fit. They began work at their kitchen table in 1998, a 3-year process of Harris talking while she typed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1999, with the declassification of Vietnam-era POW files, researcher Dr. Stuart Rochester discovered Harris's 1973 debriefing from Clark Air Base. The documents, complete with hand-drawn diagrams and detailed explanations of the TAP code, revealed something far more significant than standard POW communication. Rochester contacted Harris in early 2000, while Rochester's book, Honor Bound, American Prisoners of War in Southeast Asia, 1961-1973, co-authored with Frederick Kiley, was already published. He prepared an extensive research paper for the Air Force Historical Studies Office in 2001. That paper was the first official historical document to explicitly name Carlyle Harris as the man who introduced the TAP code to Hoa Lo Prison. The timing was perfect. As Rochester's paper circulated among military historians, Harris and Carlyle Louise's memoir, Tap Code, was released in 2008. While not a bestseller, the book reached its intended audience: SERE instructors, academy professors, and the military history community. For the first time, new generations of personnel learning the Tap Code also learned the name of the man who brought it to Hanoi. In 2009, the Navy SERE school curriculum at Brunswick, Maine, was updated to include an instructional video of a 75-year-old Harris. He sat at a simple table, demonstrating the code and explaining its challenges, the acoustics of concrete, the need for operational security. The video concluded with Harris tapping a final message. The camera held on his hands as students listened, then were asked to decode it. The message was 4 words: "You are not alone." Since 2009, that video has been shown to every Navy SERE student, reaching thousands of personnel. Harris's contribution extended beyond the code itself. His experience became a case study in psychological resistance, making his implementation of the Tap Code the doctrinal example for Article 4 of the Code of Conduct. "I will keep faith with my fellow prisoners." It demonstrated that keeping faith was not about grand gestures, but about daily discipline, risk management, and incremental resistance. The modern SERE curriculum reflects this lesson. Resistance is not about refusing to break, as sufficient torture can break anyone, but about limiting damage, maintaining communication, and helping others survive. This is exactly what Harris did for 7 years. The Tap Code remains mandatory SERE curriculum. Students spend hours mastering it under simulated captivity stress. The pass-fail test is daunting. Communicate a 50-word message through a concrete wall with 95% accuracy in 10 minutes. Instructors explain this standard isn't arbitrary. It reflects the proficiency Harris and his comrades achieved while starving and under torture. Taught continuously since 1973, the system Harris introduced at Hoa Lo in 1965 has been learned by an estimated 150,000 military personnel. Harris's last public presentation was in 2017, at age 83, before 1,000 cadets at the Air Force Academy. In a 20-minute speech on leadership under duress, he didn't describe torture or recount heroics. Instead, he talked about Philip Butler and Robert Shoemaker, the men who helped him refine and spread the code. He spoke of the discipline required to tap when one's hands were swollen from torture. He ended by asking for silence, then tapped the podium. 5 times, pause 3 times. "That's tea," he said. "If you're ever in a cell and you hear that, you're not alone." He sat down to a profound silence from the cadets, who were unsure whether to applaud. Harris died on April 4, 2019, at 85. Carlyle Louise had passed away in 2013. At his Arlington National Cemetery funeral, Colonel James Kassler, who was tortured alongside him, gave the eulogy. After mentioning Harris's Air Force Cross and teaching career, Kassler paused. He held up his hand and tapped his knuckles on the lectern, THANKS. The other POWs in attendance understood. To the rest, Kassler simply said, "Smitty knows what that means," before the honor guard folded the flag. At the Air Force Academy's POW MIA Memorial, the Tap Code's 555 grid is carved in stone. Unexplained, it is a message for those who know. Beneath it, a small plaque installed in 2020 honors Captain Carlyle S. Harris, USAF. Introduced the Tap Code to American POWs at Hoa Lo Prison, Hanoi, April 1965. Communication is resistance. SERE instructors bring students to this memorial. They explain how the man it honors spent 2,143 days tapping on walls so others would not feel forgotten. Students practice tapping their own names, then fall silent to listen. On quiet days, a rhythm carries on the air, not from ghosts, but from other students across the memorial learning the same code. The tapping spreads. Harris would have appreciated that.